What's that? You want a content warning? Sure, why not? I'll give you one. This video is all about Prager U treating homeless people like they're not human. So if you'd rather not hear the most privileged people on Earth complain about the least privileged people on Earth, maybe give this one a skip. You gotta press record before every video. That's key. Okay, so full disclosure, I wanted to make fun of a different video today, also by Prager University. The cringiest video I've ever seen them put up. It was a video about how to celebrate the 4th of July progressively. It was gonna be a lot of fun. We were gonna have a few laughs. Everybody was gonna walk away happy that I did it.
Oh, didn't see you there. Well, once again, it's the time of the year where we celebrate the birthday of the US of A. You may think of hot dogs, fireworks, a day at the beach, and listen.
So I go over to their YouTube channel to download the footage, but then on the way, I found a different video, and it bears responding to. It's called, "What Do We Do About the Homeless?" And boy, what a sinister title. Just take a moment and ask yourself what the bloodthirsty hobgoblins over at Prager University think should be done about homeless people. If you ask me, it's give them homes, let them live in homes like humans should get to, because, and I can't stress this enough, they're people with guts and ears and skeletons and everything. Homes are useful places where you can go to not die if the weather gets extreme, like, for example, if it were the hottest summer on record, where you can keep your stuff with reasonable confidence that it will not be stolen, and where you can go to the bathroom without buying anything from Starbucks. But do you think that that is the solution that Prager University comes to? Do you think that giving the unhoused houses suits the agenda of petro-billionaires? No. They view things a little different. It's not a problem of people suffering, but a dangerous nuisance for people who do have homes, the real victims of homelessness. You see, the homeless, as PU like to call them, because they want you to forget that they're talking about human beings with their own internal lives, so they choose a particular phrasing that lets them present homeless people as like a horde of zombies. Just kind of spontaneously erupt from nowhere, and it's the job of policymakers to manage where they go. Bad policies attract the homeless, and good public policies redirect the homeless towards some other place, presumably with more homes. This video is hosted by Christopher Rufo, a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, the guy who invented pretending that critical race theory is a big problem we should all care about. Seriously, the fact that it's the only thing the right wing talks about anymore is all this motherfucker's fault. He's the guy that started it. And the first thing he wants you to know is that this isn't a housing problem. People being unhoused isn't a housing problem. It's a human problem.
Let's start with a couple facts. First, the word itself is misleading. Homelessness is not primarily a housing problem, it's a human problem. The primary drivers of homelessness are drug addiction and mental illness.
So the solution is obvious. Just pump more money into mental health and addiction services, right? That's clear, isn't it? Just help people with mental health issues and addictions, and then 3/4 of your problem is solved, right? You're gonna bring that up, right?
Second, despite these conditions, the homeless actually make rational decisions about where they want to live. Not surprisingly, they move to the most permissive environment they can find.
Okay, so they're suffering from drug addiction and mental illness, but still make rational decisions about where they want to live. I would argue that certain mental illnesses actually make it pretty difficult to make rational decisions all of the time, and that's not to say that mentally ill people are incapable of making choices for themselves, but sometimes they sure do make irrational choices because that's what mental illness is. Likewise, I think being dependent on a drug might complicate the reasoning you make about where you live if you can only get that drug in certain places. It's all a fig leaf. He's just saying they're rational actors because it's beep boop conservative robot economics 101. If we allow ourselves to believe that some people may not be in full control of their actions, then it becomes more difficult to justify punishing them for those actions, which is, spoiler alert, what he thinks we ought to do. The world must be a fair, sensible place in which people's lives are dictated by the choices they make, and therefore, everyone deserves to have whatever they have and lack whatever they lack. If you're born with a mental illness, one that, for example, makes you think that everyone you know is part of a satanic conspiracy to murder you, you might run away from your home and live on the streets. And that choice might seem rational to you, based on your delusions. That doesn't make it rational. So does the person this happened to deserve to live on the streets? What about someone whose untreated mental illness causes their parents to grow frustrated and kick them out? They didn't even make a choice then, it's just something that happened to them, based on things beyond their control. If we take a look at the source for this data, something that Rufo conveniently leaves out of his assessment is that a significant portion of people become unhoused due to physical health conditions, and many more, women in particular, become unhoused due to trauma and abuse. And that's weird to me, because why wouldn't you mention that? Why would you only mention mental health and drug addiction? The part about physical health conditions is a major part of the study, because one of the key findings is that people with health problems are not getting adequate care at emergency shelters. Like, that's one of the things the people who wrote the study want you to take away from it. People with the longest experiences of homelessness, most significant health concerns, and greatest vulnerabilities are not accessing or being served by emergency shelters. As policymakers design interventions for unsheltered homelessness and balance investments in emergency housing and permanent housing, they will need to consider whether emergency housing is adequate or appropriate for a highly vulnerable population, half of whom are trimorbid. Again, this is their source. The data they cherry-picked is about drug addiction and mental health, but the data about physical health, abuse, and trauma is ignored. And I think that what's happening here is Rufo is trying to frame homeless people as dangerous and unpredictable, in hopes that their audience's biases against drug addicts and the mentally ill will make them leap to that conclusion, despite the fact that, like, drug addicts and mentally ill people aren't necessarily more violent than anyone else, and in fact, mentally ill people are by far more likely to be the victims of violence than the perpetrators. But he doesn't think you think that. So he's trying to use those things to make him seem scary, is what I'm saying. It's hard to paint abuse victims as though they're going to steal your car stereo, but you can do that pretty easily with drug addicts, because most people already think that about drug addicts. He gets into how homeless people are dangerous criminals later. That's a part of the later, that he'll get to that. Something else that sticks out to me here is that they're not talking about how to prevent people from becoming homeless, but rather how to dissuade people who are already homeless from living in your city, which will obviously reduce the homeless population in your area, but it's not, you're not fixing the problem. Like, if all homeless people are forced to live out in the woods, that's not a win. That leaves them vulnerable to Sasquatch attacks, among other logistical issues. If the problem is having to be around homeless people, sure, I guess you're fixing that problem, you horrible ghoul. But if the problem is that other human beings are suffering and dying needlessly, that's still an issue, and you've just swept it under the rug. You just kicked the can down the road. It's someone else's problem now. So much for conservative personal responsibility. Rufo goes on to illustrate his point about incentivizing homeless behavior by offering the example of an underpass that straddles the border between Los Angeles and Culver City.
The Venice Boulevard underpass on the border of Los Angeles and Culver City brings home this point. The Los Angeles side is full of tents, and the Culver City side is empty, because the two cities have different public policies. Los Angeles has effectively decriminalized public camping and drug consumption, while Culver City enforces the law.
Now this one is a particularly egregious lie, a real fun little lie he just told. Not a misrepresentation, an outright lie. You see, according to the Los Angeles Times, the U.S. Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled last year that homeless individuals may not be held criminally responsible for sleeping on government property when no alternative shelter is available. Bonin, whose council district touches Santa Monica, Culver City, and El Segundo, said he believes many cities in the region are not complying with that decision. Instead of allowing people to sleep on their sidewalks, they are encouraging people or compelling people to move to the city of Los Angeles to do that, he said. Buscano and Bonin said that for years their constituents believed that with sidewalk encampments allowed in their city and not in other communities nearby, homeless individuals would gravitate to their neighborhoods. Such a disparity can be seen on the Venice Boulevard at the 405 freeway, Bonin said, with homeless people on the LA side of the street but not on the Culver City side. People are understandably asking why the hell that is, Bonin said. And it's because the city of Los Angeles is obeying the court dictates and the city across the street isn't. So it's not that Culver City is enforcing the law. It's actually precisely the opposite of that. They are refusing to comply with the law, which states that homeless people can sleep on government property if no alternative housing is provided for them. Instead of letting them do that, they're either strongly encouraging anyone on their side of the border to go to the Los Angeles side, or, allegedly, just picking them up themselves and dropping them off there. And just, by the way, just one little thing, that LA Times article that I just quoted, that's their source. This article, which debunks their claim in the second paragraph, is the only source for that claim. The claim which the article says the opposite of. But like, okay, the lie they're telling is pretty weird, right? Because if it were true, and Los Angeles legalized street camping and drug doing, but Culver City didn't, Los Angeles isn't failing to enforce the law. They would have different laws. You can't enforce a law that isn't the law. It's like he's implying that there's some universal objective set of laws to be enforced, that it's illegal to have the wrong laws, and that he, Christopher Rufo, knows what the right laws are, and those are the ones to be obeyed, not the ones the court dictates, which seems a little totalitarian to me. Rufo goes on to cite two examples which he claims support his belief that cities with permissive attitudes attract homeless people like moths to a flame. The population of homeless people in San Francisco that became homeless in San Francisco is a scant, negligible 70%. And the population of Seattle that became homeless from outside Seattle is 52%, the majority. That proves it, right? Homeless people are moving from the good places, which treat them badly, to the bad places, which treat them well. Case closed. But just in case Rufo's rigorous mind missed something, let's take a look at the sources he provided for this data. The article from KQED, which sources the San Francisco claim, once you scroll past all the boring info which actively contradicts other things Rufo has said in this video, weird, had this to say on the subject. An oft-cited statistic from homeless advocates, about 70% of people who are homeless became homeless while living in the Bay Area. That means 30% are coming here to be homeless, says Cooper. That's still a ton of people. I think until we start to talk about those numbers, we're not really addressing people's concerns. When we deny that San Francisco is, as Fox News would say, a magnet for homelessness, if we don't talk about the actual facts, we really lose an opportunity to deal with this population. So it doesn't really source that claim, it just sort of says that it's an oft-cited statistic. But you might notice that it does not say that San Francisco attracts homeless people because of its lenient policies about street camping or whatever. You might also notice the weird jump in logic that Audrey Cooper seems to be making here when she says that because some people were homeless before they moved to the Bay Area, they thusly moved there to be homeless. Like maybe they moved there to try to find a job, or because they had friends and family there, or they thought they could find a home there, though that last one's maybe a little unlikely given housing prices in San Francisco. Either way, it doesn't say what Rufo claims, but it's nowhere near as bad as how he twists the second source. The data about Seattle comes from the City of Seattle 2016 Homeless Needs Assessment, and watch how Rufo presents it.
In a research survey of homeless migrants in Seattle, 15% said they came to access homeless services, 10% came for legal marijuana, and 16% were transients who were traveling or visiting when they decided to set up camp. But this dramatically understates the biggest draw of all, the de facto legalization of street camping, drug consumption, and property crime.
First of all, Rufo claims that 51% of the homeless population in Seattle was homeless before they lived in Seattle. Of the people who moved to Seattle after becoming homeless, the majority were from the greater Seattle metropolitan area, about 32.4% of the homeless population. That number brings us up to about 81.3% of the population being from like around Seattle, which is a lot less scary sounding. Only 15% of the homeless people were from a different state. Furthermore, Rufo discusses that 15% of people were transients, traveling or visiting. 10% were for legal marijuana, and 16% were there for access to homeless services. A generous rounding of the 15.4% figure. Wow, I wonder if he's leaving anything out there. Oh, look at that, 69%, nice, of the people who moved did so because they had friends or family in the area or had work lined up.
The biggest draw of all, the de facto legalization of street camping, drug consumption, and property crime.
Rufo also failed to note that respondents could give more than one answer, meaning that not all of the people who claimed to move to Seattle for legal weed did it for that reason alone, necessarily. Or the 9.6% of people who moved for reasons of, quote, LGBTQ acceptance. Again, this is his source. I didn't have to search this information out. Then he says this.
San Francisco Chronicle estimates that hundreds of homeless individuals move to the Bay Area each year because of the perception that it is a sanctuary for people who are unwilling to participate in programs designed to get them off and keep them off a life in the streets.
No, it doesn't. The exact quote from the San Francisco Chronicle is, also, San Francisco, which gets an influx of about 450 chronically homeless people a year, needs to shed any perception that it is a sanctuary for people who are unwilling to participate in programs designed to get them off and keep them off a life in the streets. It is neither inhumane nor, quote, criminalizing poverty to enforce laws against aggressive panhandling, tent encampments, or defecation and urination in public places. Now, of course it is. I strongly disagree with the sentiment expressed in this article, but it doesn't say what Rufo is claiming it says. It states that San Francisco gets about 450 chronically homeless people a year, and that it has a perception that it's a sanctuary for people who are unwilling to participate, blah, blah, blah. But it does not estimate, let alone demonstrate, that these two things are causally related. It does say that a lot more money needs to be spent on housing many times, but curiously, Rufo doesn't mention that part. So Rufo starts praising the mayor of Houston, who, despite being a Democrat, is apparently tough on homelessness.
Houston's policy is a perfect example of what Turner calls a tough love approach. The city has built housing for the chronically homeless, formed a coalition of nonprofit partners, and lobbied the state government for more mental health and addiction services. At the same time, Turner has enforced a strict ban on public camping and promoted a citywide campaign to discourage citizens from giving money to panhandlers.
So that's interesting, isn't it? This guy's policies are to, 1, provide housing and social welfare programs, and 2, to penalize things homeless people do. But when Rufo argues what should be learned from this example, he only talks about the penalization.
If cities stop allowing public encampments and open drug consumption and start prosecuting property crimes, they will have much more success redirecting the homeless away from a life of self-destruction and toward a life of hope through mental health treatment, drug rehab, and job training.
And while Houston is providing more housing and is removing street camps, it seems that they're just redirecting the people in the street camps to the housing, not arresting them or punishing them. Now, I'm under no illusions here. I'm sure the police are being needlessly violent, as they are everywhere. But this certainly isn't the policy Rufo is suggesting. Rufo frames this to be about punishment, consequences, etc. He claims that Houston, unlike other cities, has consequences for theft, aggressive panhandling, window washing, and other street obstructions, and links to the Houston Municipal Code's laws against those things, and not any evidence of those laws being enforced more so than most other cities, which, likewise, would have laws against those things because almost everywhere does. His claim that theft goes unpunished is also just buck-fucking wild. He claims that California has decriminalized theft under $950, and I don't think I have to tell you that that's not true.
California progressives push for more drug injection sites and have decriminalized thefts under $950. Houston imposes consequences not only for theft, but for aggressive panhandling, window washing, and other street obstructions.
He's citing a 2014 bill, which in fact recategorized theft under $950 as a misdemeanor rather than a felony. It's still a crime, and it's still potentially punishable by jail time. It hasn't been decriminalized. Rufo presents other cities as lawless hexscapes, where politicians are afraid to spray the feces off of sidewalks because hoses are racist.
A Seattle politician opposes hosing down feces-covered sidewalks because hoses are racist. Houston fights in the courts for the right to clean up encampments.
Sounds like critical race theory to me, demonizing our white hoses. There's no way that there's any context that makes this go from a bizarre non sequitur to a pretty reasonable thing to say. But just in case, let's take a look to, let's Google this. Turns out that this is a reference to a manufactured scandal from 2017 where Seattle City Council member Larry Gossett didn't want to spray a homeless encampment that locals said smelled bad with a power washer because it wouldn't actually fix the problem, it would just hurt people. Like, just hosing down an area is going to force people out and maybe ruin their stuff, and yes, also clean the sidewalk, but it doesn't solve the fact that these people have nowhere to go, and as long as that's the case, they'll live on the street. And as long as they're living on the street, they're gonna piss and shit on the street because they don't have a fucking bathroom. And also, he pointed out that it looks uncomfortably like the way fire hoses were used against civil rights protesters. He never used the words racist, racism, racially insensitive, or anything of the sort. But Rufo did go ahead and put the word racist in quotation marks in their citations. Very honest stuff. Seattle, surprise, surprise, does not have a policy against spraying down feces-covered sidewalks in general, and they did clean this encampment. People living there be damned. So it's a little disingenuous to say that Houston won't wash their sidewalks if they're covered in shit. It's a little disingenuous to claim that the motivation behind this was some kind of insistence that hoses are racist. What really chaps me about this video is that even if they weren't lying constantly in it, which they were, as I've demonstrated many times, even if the evidence they offered was 100% unassailable, the solutions they're offering don't even try to fix the problem. They just want to make things difficult for homeless people. They just want to force them out of their cities because they don't like being around them. What do you think's going to happen? No matter how hostile you make being homeless in your city, it's not going to do shit to prevent people from becoming homeless. Tearing down homeless encampments or giving cops more powers to harass and arrest drug users just makes things harder for the people whose lives are already the hardest that lives can be. Rufo talks a lot about compassion in this video, but I don't see any evidence of it. It looks to me like when Rufo sees a homeless person struggling on the streets, hard sleeping, a human being who might have been abused, traumatized, might have been kicked out of their home for being gay and didn't have anywhere else to go, maybe a mentally ill person desperately in need of treatment, maybe somebody who lost their job, as thousands of people did just recently because a lot of jobs weren't sustainable during the COVID-19 pandemic. Maybe somebody who was unlucky enough to get hurt and their doctor gave them a painkiller to make the pain go away, and now they have to have that painkiller every day, and maybe that ruined their life. When Rufo sees another one of God's children, someone who feels all the same things he does, somebody who was once someone else's baby, living in squalid camps, pissing and shitting on the street because nobody will let them do it anywhere else, shivering, wet, and cold in the dark, he thinks to himself, God, why can't someone make them go away? Not me, though. I'm making fun of a guy on the internet for saying stuff like that. Wait, that's not much better. Let's go ahead and donate $200 to the Period Purse, a nonprofit which gives menstruators the sanitary items and education they need to have safe and healthy periods, no matter their situation. Menstruating is expensive and potentially dangerous under the types of conditions that homeless people are often forced to live under. Link in the description if you want to check them out. By the way, because I know some people are going to ask, the reason I use the term menstruator is because not all women menstruate and not all people who menstruate are women. And some people are actually just eyeballs in disguise spying on us and reporting us to the powers they... Hello and welcome to the Eyeball Zone. Here in the Eyeball Zone, we have contempt for all of humanity, not simply the vulnerable portions of humanity like Prager U does. And also we put a spotlight on small leftist creators. Essential oils. Everybody loves these stinky little guys. But did you know that also some people think that they're gonna cure diseases? Well, it turns out that a real shithead is behind that, and you can learn more about it in this video by Clowntown, which goes into a frankly absurd amount of detail. Like, the amount of research that she had to do for this it's too much. She should not have done this much research. It is too much. She did too much. Boy, I wish there was a way for you to get your project here in the Eyeball Zone. Oh wait, there is. Go ahead and send me exactly one email to thoughtslimeeditor@gmail.com with the word eyeball somewhere in the description and pertinent details like your pronouns, and perhaps you will find yourself trapped here in the Eyeball Zone.